Next up, we have Governor David Alexander Paterson, who became the 55th governor of the state of New York in March 2008. Governor Patterson earned his BA in history from Columbia University and his JD from Hofstra Law School. Prior to becoming New York governor, David began his political career when he was elected to represent Harlem in 1985 at the age of 31, making him the third youngest state senator in New York's history. In 2002, he was elected as minority leader of the New York State Senate, becoming the first African American and blind legislative leader in the state's history. In 2014, Patterson was appointed as chairman of the New York State Democratic Party and served on the board of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Among his many accomplishments is a popular drive-time talk show radio on WABC-AM. At present, he is the vice president and senior advisor to Las Vegas Sands Corporation. David recently published his autobiography, which I personally cannot wait to read, Black, Blind, and in Charge, a story of visionary leadership and overcoming adversity. So now allow me to read his quote, if it gets put up there. Thank you. What Bob Dylan means to me. Bob Dylan challenged the morality of our souls, not by telling us what to do, by merely asking us, how many years will it take? Thank you, Governor Patterson, if you will. Thank you.
I always like to hear an introduction of myself, as we all do. But I always like how they just happen to mention that I became governor in March of 2008. Now, there was no election in March of 2008. I think all of you know that the governor resigned in a prostitution scandal. I always think of it as the best benefit I ever got from sex, and I wasn't even there. So I would like to thank FIU and also the Frost Museum and all of you who have put this number of events together today. And I don't know why I had to speak after Rebecca Friedman, but it was really very interesting hearing her thoughts as she was growing up and how Bob Dylan related to all of them. And I thought that as a woman who was coming into her own as a woman, that it was actually a man who could identify with that struggle. And that's really what is the greatest thing about Bob Dylan. Now, he can somehow find a way into all corners of the globe and will find a way into the community surrounding these schools, even if their ethnicity is a little different than other places. I also want to thank Shai Patel, who must have been more than any other human being that I ever met, given the opposite first name to the way he actually conducts himself. And he is the impresario he describes himself as an artistic director. The great George Lois, whose exploits were chronicled in the TV series Mad Men, also said that he was an artistic director. But in fact, they both do everything. I'm just amazed at the number of creative and different activities that Shai involves himself, and it's a wonderful, Shai, for you to invite me to be part of this event. And finally, to Dr. Kimberly Green, I really enjoyed your thoughts growing up about Dylan and the writers that you admired. So I want you to know that in my early 20s, I lived next door to the brother of James Baldwin, David Baldwin. So I just assumed that one day I would meet James Baldwin, and I never did. Finally, in 1986, James Baldwin passed away, and a couple of days later, his brother, David Baldwin, came over and asked me if he could borrow a hammer. And when I got the hammer, I said to him, you know, there was this woman crying all through your brother's funeral. Does she feel better now? He said, David, we have no idea who that person is. But there are people who go to funerals because they just like to have a good cry. So I just am so delighted to be here with all of you. And I would begin by saying that Ian Rand wrote a book years ago. And a few years later, they made a movie out of the book. And the name of the book was The Fountainhead. And in that book and in that movie, Gary Cooper really captures the feeling about the underdevelopment of civilization by describing, and I quote, that thousands of years ago, the first person invented fire. And although they were probably burned at the stake that they taught their brothers and sisters to light, nevertheless, they offered the world a gift that had never been perceived before and lifted darkness from the face of the earth. So when you think about that, and you think about the evolution of civilization, throughout the centuries, there have been men and women who took first steps down new roads, armed with nothing but their own vision. The great creators, the thinkers, the artists, the musicians, the scientists, and inventors stood alone against the societies of their time. Every new thought was opposed, every new dimension, every new invention, every new opportunity was denounced. But these people who had an unbarred vision forged ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid for it, but they won. And what is imbued in them to give us this opportunity that we have today is that they freed themselves. And by freeing themselves, they freed others. And this is why we're here today, to talk about a man who freed himself and consequently freed others. And so Bob Dylan had that challenge in the late summer of 1965 at the Newport Folk Festival, when after 45 minutes of just enjoying his music, and he had the crowd jumping and screaming, urging him on, he decided to do something new. He wanted the audience to hear him play the electric guitar. Suffice it to say, this did not go well. There were boos, there were jeers, there was debris flown, and nearly a riotous condition that even the other well-known musicians at the time could not quell the anguish of this crowd. And the returns, the recount of this election, this decision to play an electric guitar, were even worse. Even the great folk singer Pete Seeger commented that he would take an axe and chop off the cord to Bob Dylan's electric guitar because he was playing electric and not acoustic. Now, Pete Seeger was one who often excoriated the United States government for not giving freedoms to all people, but yet, in the individual sense, he couldn't grant the freedom to a colleague to move in his own way. So he went from waist deep in the big muddy to neck deep in the big hypocritical way that he handled that situation. And as I would like to think, he went from being one of the great folk singers and social commentators at our time to a plant in Rick Nelson's garden party. So, but the more important aspect of this situation and this incident was that Bob Dylan was willing to inject himself into this situation. He was willing to live for himself. And by living for himself, I don't mean selfishness or self-aggrandizement or self-centeredness. I mean a person who follows his own path in spite of what the audiences did. And in the end, when we look back on it, it paved the way to some other great works of art that he produced that he would not have been had he been too timid to be himself in front of an audience. I was a fan of Bob Dylan before I knew he was Bob Dylan, because of all the songs that I thought had been attributed to other people, and actually they were written by him. So in my life, the turning point came on August 28th, 1963. That was the date of the famous March on Washington. I set my alarm for 3 o'clock in the morning because our family was going to go to Washington and be part of the march. I was informed when I woke up by my parents that I wasn't going to Washington. And the reason was because there were a number of fears and threats from groups who were antagonistic and antithetical to what the March on Washington would stand for, that they might attack the marchers. So the size of the crowd was reduced substantially, and yet my parents went to the march, and I watched it on television, where I heard a woman play a song that touched my heart. It was Blowing in the Wind, and the artist was Joan Baez. And about a year later, they had an album about the March on Washington called We Shall Overcome, and Joan Baez singing Blowing in the Wind is how the album starts. And then, of course, the great speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, his I Have a Dream speech, followed. By the way, many people think that that was the first time Martin Luther King ever offered his I Have the Dream speech. He had actually done the speech 40 times, moving around the South in civil rights demonstrations before the march, to the point that the people who worked with him were sick of hearing that speech. And they would even make fun of his speech when they were in the shower, let water float down like a mighty stream, and all these jokes they made about him. And finally, they sat him down before the march and they said, you must change this speech. And you're not leaving this room until you promise to change it. And he did change the speech. The original name of the speech was something I don't remember. But he changed the name of the speech from Let Freedom Ring to I Have a Dream. That's the only change he made. And in the end, he was proven right. The issues that of the song were just that 2 years later, I'm in a school assembly, and we had a gentleman. He came in, he spoke to us, he played the guitar. He was just kind of a great person for young people to meet. He encouraged us. And at the end, he said, I'm going to play a song by a man who wants to change some things in the world. And he played Blowing in the Wind. So I turned to my friend Warren Stein and I said, Warren, why is he saying a young man who wanted to change the world? That song was by Joan Baez, whereupon Warren corrected me that the song was by somebody named Bob Dylan. And I said, Dylan? The only Dylan I ever heard of was James Arness playing the sheriff in Gunsmoke. So when that was really my introduction. And then I just have, over the years, learned every time I thought somebody wrote a good song, it turned out to be Bob Dylan, like All Along the Watchtower, which I thought was written by Jimi Hendrix, but no, it was Bob Dylan. And then there was Just Like a Woman, covered by many artists. My favorite recording is by Nina Simone, but the writer was Bob Dylan. And then, of course, Mr. Tambourine Man, the song wasn't by the Byrds, it was for the Byrds by Bob Dylan. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which was thought to have been written by Abraham Lincoln, was actually written by Bob Dylan. And I'm glad after all these years we've gotten that cleared up. So the real issues concerning Bob Dylan are really that he was a person who was not afraid to inject himself into places where he believed in a cause or he believed in the people that he was helping. And this obviously was a huge situation in 1976 when he was called upon by George Lois, the art director, to help in a case involving a former lightweight boxing champion by the name of Reuben Hurricane Carter. And Dylan went to visit Hurricane Carter and then wrote the song The Hurricane. Now, the interesting thing about this is they had talked to all the major artists, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Tony Bennett. They'd all gotten involved with the civil rights movement of Dr. King, but wouldn't touch this. Even the great black performers, Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder, none of them wanted to have anything to do with this situation, but Bob Dylan came forward and wrote the song The Hurricane. And this, again, demonstrated that Bob Dylan was not going to worry about his reputation or what people thought about him. He was going to write this song that inevitably was a transcendental song, because it not only changed thinking in the white community, he, as a white man, changed thinking in the black community, to the point that in 1994, when O.J. Simpson was accused of killing someone, the entire community rallied around him. They were wrong. He was guilty. And I got in trouble once for writing an article about the O.J. Simpson trial called They Framed a Guilty Man. And the point was that they did frame him, and they did also frame Reuben Hurricane Carter. Well, we got one right. So the point is that Bob Dylan, again, was willing to make that sacrifice, and Bob Dylan challenged all of us to think in terms of how we see other people. So really, he was dynamic, articulate, he was perceptive, he was courageous, he was outspoken. He was one of those people who just had this capacity to reach others. Quite often, when we would go to schools and we would talk to students, we tell them, if you ever get yourself in a position where you can help the younger people in your own community, don't forget where you came from. And that's an honorable trait for people to have. But with Bob Dylan, it was a little different. He didn't forget where other people came from, and how he seemed to understand that, how he had that sensitivity and that willingness to listen and that willingness to understand is beyond so many of us, which is why we continue to honor him and why they're always quite a mystery to us. Now, Bob Dylan, I don't know why, but he is the repository for people who say that he tells you stories that aren't true, and he made the documentary with Martin Scorsese where the actress Sharon Stone says she followed the band when she was younger. Apparently that never happened. And then they had a guy there, Senator Tanner. There was no Senator Tanner. He was actually the character in a mockumentary back in the 80s, and they took the actor and made him pretend that he really was the senator in the documentary. And so Bob Dylan, you know, has told these stories that just aren't true from time to time. But I don't know why he gets all the castigation, when in fact, in one of the great songs of all time, Way Down Upon the Swanee River by Stephen Foster never saw the Swanee River. He lived in South Carolina, and he wrote the song about a place called the PD River. And when they were going to market with the song, one of the producers said, that name isn't right. So they looked on the map, and they found the Swanee River, which is actually in the state of Florida, a long way from where Mr. Foster lived. Then we have the situation involving the Beatles. They learned that you could take some words and play them backwards, and they would mean other words, and created this whole illusion that Paul McCartney was actually deceased. So in the song The Walrus, here's another clue for you all: the walrus is Paul. Then they said backwards, but if you learned, as I did when I had a 7.5-inch reel-to-reel tape recorder, if you reverse the tape, you could get what they were really saying. And John Lennon is whispering, Paul is dead now, miss you, miss you, miss you. So they went through this whole charade for years. They've never denied that, they've never admitted that they actually did it, but they did it. Now, how is all this any different than Bob Dylan? When it's serious is when the artist's talent is misused. The number of artists who recorded songs, many of them African-American, whose the titles were changed and the names were changed, and other artists got credit for their work. And then finally, one of the worst situations in music history, the album cover of albums by the late singer Bessie Smith, who was reported to have been hit by a car and then denied ambulance service, or when they got to the hospital, the admission to a southern hospital in Alabama. The reality was that she was hit by a car, a doctor drove by, he didn't want to drive her in his car, but he had to meet him at a hospital. She was admitted to the hospital, but died there. The story was changed by the producers of the albums, who were making money by antagonizing the audience that loved Bessie Smith. That's when dishonesty works to the detriment of the artist. So Bob Dylan really, in some of these charades that he plays, is challenging us. And what I've always thought is that Bob Dylan doesn't always tell us the truth because he knows we don't always want to hear the truth. And of course, it is such that we really learn that art is really a display. It's not always accurate, but it challenges to think about what actually is accurate. So as we celebrate him and celebrate all that he's given to us, it's my honor to be a part of it. And Bob, if you're out there listening, if there's ever been any point that you thought that people didn't really totally hear your message, we know there was a lot you had to endure, but I think today you'll know for sure. Thank you very much.